It's harvest time, in a village so small it barely has a name of its own to speak of. Woolpit, they call it, for the old wolf pits dug at its edge, long before anyone living there could say why. On one particular evening, in a field of cut wheat turning gold in the last of the light, the reapers straighten their backs and go still. Two children stand at the mouth of one of those old pits. A boy and a girl, ordinary in shape and size, except for one thing. Their skin from head to foot is green. This happened, or is said to have happened, in the English county of Suffolk in the 12th century, during the reign of King Stephen, sometime between 1135 and 1154. Two chroniclers wrote it down, years apart, each one certain it was true, each one telling it a little differently. And by the end of tonight's story, you'll have heard the strangest part of it. Not the color of their skin. The place the girl said she came from, a place that 875 years later, nobody has ever found. Get comfortable. This one moves slowly, the way the truth usually does. Here is what the record actually says, as closely as we can tell it. A monk named Ralph, who kept the chronicle at Coggeshall Abbey, wrote this story down. So did a canon named William at Newburgh Priory in Yorkshire, working from what he'd been told. They never met, as far as anyone knows. They agreed on most of it. They didn't agree on all of it, and we'll let that stand tonight, rather than smoothing it over, because that disagreement is part of what makes this a real historical record, rather than a fireside tale polished smooth by retelling. Both agree it happened at Woolpit, near those old wolf pits, at harvest time. Both agree the children were a brother and sister, ordinary in every way except their skin, and except for the fact that their clothing was cut from some material nobody in the village recognized. And both agree that when the villagers spoke to them gently, trying every kindness they knew, the children answered in a language that meant nothing to anyone standing there. Ralph tells us exactly where he got the story, and that matters more than it might sound like it should. He names his source, a knight called Richard de Calne of the Manor of Wykes, about 6 miles north of Woolpit. Richard de Calne was a real man whose name turns up in other records of the period, land grants and legal rolls entirely apart from this story. He was alive through the 1130s into the 1160s and dead by 1188. When a medieval chronicler writing about something this strange names a real checkable person as his source, it's worth noticing it doesn't prove the story true, but it tells you it wasn't invented from nothing. It was to Richard de Calne's household that the children were brought. They wept, both of them, we're told, as they were led in. They wouldn't eat. Not that first day, not the days after. Whatever the household offered, they turned away from it, and the people caring for them must have started to worry in earnest. And here's the part that stayed with people for 800 years, the small human detail tucked inside the strangeness. Somebody, eventually, thought to try beans, raw, broad beans, still sitting in their pale green pods on the stalk, not cooked, not prepared. And the children, for the first time since anyone had found them, reached for them eagerly, pulling the pods open themselves, hunting at first for the beans inside the pods rather than the beans themselves, until someone showed them which part to eat. It's such a small moment to have survived 8.5 centuries. But it's the first real bridge in this story, the first thing that reached two frightened children in a language that had nothing to do with words at all. From there, slowly, things widened. Bread first, then whatever the rest of the household ate. And as their diet changed, so, the chronicles tell us, did their color. The green faded, week by week, until both children looked like any other children in Suffolk, and they began picking up English, a word at a time, faster than any adult could have. But not both of them got to finish that journey. The boy, always the more delicate of the two, sickened and did not recover. The record tells us only that he was baptized and that he died, and we can't even be fully certain, from the wording, whether the baptism came just before or just after. It's a brief, sad thread inside an otherwise gentle story, and I won't linger on it longer than the chroniclers did. Only this, Even a story built mostly from wonder had room, in real life, for loss too. That was true 800 years ago, the same as it is now. The girl lived, and as her English grew steadier, she began to answer the question everyone in that household must have been asking since the evening they found her. Where had she come from? She called it a land of perpetual twilight, never full daylight. Ralph records her describing it as always, like an English sunset, that soft, dim in-between hour, and never any brighter than that. Everything there, she said, was tinged faintly green, the way her own skin had been. And running through it was a wide river, and on the far side of that river she could see another country entirely, bright and luminous in a way her own land never was, close enough to see, and yet somewhere she had never once been able to reach. William, writing separately, gives this place a name: St. Martin's Land. That's the whole geography we have of it. A twilight country, a river, a brighter shore glimpsed but never crossed. Nobody in 875 years has ever placed it on a map. We'll come back to what people have guessed it might really have been. But sit with the description itself for a moment, exactly as it was written down. Not a monster, not a warning. Just a girl remembering home, and a home that sounds more than anything like a dream half recalled at breakfast, vivid, coherent, and just out of reach. She told them how she and her brother came to leave it. They'd been tending their father's flock, she said, out at the edge of that twilight land, when they heard a sound, a great ringing, carrying across the fields. William likens it, in his account, to the bells of the abbey at Bury St. Edmunds, a sound his own readers would have known well, and drawn by it, the way you might follow a familiar sound without quite deciding to. The two children followed. Ralph adds a detail William leaves out, that the sound led them into a long underground passage, however you want to picture it, and that they walked through it, following the ringing until without warning they were dazzled. Ordinary daylight all at once, after however long spent in that dim twilight world. They stood there blinking, disoriented, and when their eyes adjusted, they were standing at the wolf pits at Woolpit, in a country they didn't recognize, with no way back the way they'd come. However you picture it, a passage between two literal places, or a memory reshaped afterward into something that made sense to tell, that is, as closely as we can reconstruct it, the story exactly as the girl told it, and exactly as it was written down. Now here is where the two chroniclers stop agreeing, and I think it's worth telling you honestly, rather than choosing the version that makes the tidier ending. Ralph says the girl stayed on for many years in Richard de Con's household as a servant. He adds, in his own voice, that she grew, his words, very wanton and impudent. That isn't a fact about her. That's one monk's own moral judgment, 8 centuries removed, and we can set it down exactly as what it is. An opinion, not a detail of what happened. William tells it differently. In his account, she eventually married a man from King's Lynn, a market town on the Norfolk coast, some 40 miles from Woolpit, and as far as he'd heard, at the time he was writing, she was still living there. A servant who stayed. A wife who moved away and lived out an ordinary life by the sea. 2 different endings, from 2 different men, neither of whom, as far as we know, ever spoke to the other. That isn't a flaw in the story. That's what a real historical record actually looks like, once you get close enough to it. A little unresolved, a little contradictory, refusing to close as neatly as a story invented for effect would close. So what happened? People have been asking that for 875 years, and nobody has landed on an answer everybody agrees with. A few of the guesses are worth hearing, gently, as guesses, not answers. One historian, Paul Harris, writing in 1998, proposed the children were Flemish immigrant children, caught up in a period when Flemish settlers in that part of England were being violently pushed out, wandering lost and frightened, speaking a language the villagers simply didn't recognize as language at all. Harris even points to a real nearby village, Fornham St. Martin, as a possible echo of St. Martin's Land, and links their displacement to a real battle fought there in 1173. It's a compelling theory, and it has a real problem too. William dates this story to the reign of King Stephen, which ended in 1154, nearly 20 years before that battle happened. Other historians have also questioned whether an educated household in a county with real trade from the continent would truly have failed to recognize spoken Flemish at all. A serious theory, taken seriously by serious people, and a theory with a real hole in it. Both can be true at once. Another idea reaches for something more physical, a condition sometimes called green sickness, a kind of anemia caused by poor diet, which really can tint the skin faintly green and would fade, as the theory goes, once a person began eating properly again. It fits the fading. But it has a counter-argument too. If malnutrition alone explained it, plenty of poor children in 12th century Suffolk would have shown the same colouring, and yet the chroniclers describe this green as something startling, something nobody there had ever seen before. So, maybe part of the answer. Probably not the whole of it. And then there's a quieter observation, less a theory about what happened than about why the story feels the way it does. Scholars looking closely at English and Welsh folklore have noticed this exact shape, a passage underground into a dim twilight country with a way back that can never quite be found again. Turning up in other medieval stories too, including a very similar tale, recorded separately, about a boy led underground into a twilight land, written down by a churchman named Gerald of Wales. Whatever really happened in that harvest field, the way it got told and retold may have been shaped, at least a little, by a story pattern that was already old by the time anyone wrote this one down. That doesn't make it false. It just means we're hearing it through a very old kind of telling. And yes, because people will always reach further than the evidence allows, a 17th century writer named Robert Burton floated the idea that the children had simply fallen from the sky, an idea that helped inspire one of the very first English science fiction stories a few decades later. Modern fringe writers have gone further still, toward underground civilizations and beyond. I mention it only because it's part of how this story has traveled, not because there's a shred of evidence for any of it. Here's a detail I've saved for the end, because I think it belongs there. William of Newburgh, the very chronicler who wrote this story down, opens his own account with a confession. He says, close to his actual words, that he had for a long time doubted the story himself, even though it had reached him from many people he trusted, because it seemed to him almost absurd to accept as real something whose explanation was so obscure, or perhaps didn't exist at all. Think about that for a moment. The man who wrote this down for history to keep wasn't fully sure what to make of it either. And 875 years later, neither are we. Maybe it was two lost, frightened children from somewhere much closer to home than a twilight country, misunderstood into something stranger than they were. Maybe there's a plainer explanation, and we simply don't have enough of the record left to reach it. Or maybe, and this is the part I like best, the part that doesn't need solving to be worth keeping, maybe some stories are allowed to just stay open. A green field at dusk, a sound like distant bells, a door that only opens once. Wherever the truth of it lies, it's still sitting there in an old English chronicle, waiting, the same as it's waited for 8.5 centuries already. It can wait a little longer. If you enjoyed drifting through this one, there are more true stories like it waiting for you. Follow for more and let the next one find you when you're ready for it. Until then, sleep well.